Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We are talking national political news of the day, and there's a lot of news, but we're going to start with what was looking to be very interesting developments in Russia and their implications for United States politics. We didn't know what was going on. There was appeared to be a military coup attempt, people thought, or some type of protest by Prigozhin's Wagner group, a private military group of mercenaries that had been fairly successful, probably the most successful military force in Ukraine. There had been some move, apparently, because of some political popularity on the part of the leadership, possibly. We don't really know. It's really hazy, but there had been a move to dismantle the organization. And as a matter of protest, they mobilized and went on, took a trip towards Moscow. They suffered a missile attack where they lost several dozen soldiers. Reports of further aerial attacks. The Prigozhin later said, "We killed no troops on the ground." He kept saying that over and over again, but there were reports that they brought down as many as 6 helicopters and 1 fixed-wing aircraft. Crews and several died. But we've seen lots of photos, but there have been claims that some of those photos and clips might have been from the Ukraine war earlier, but we don't know at any rate. But Prigozhin was not wanting to brag about it. That's what makes me think that that might have been real. He kept saying over and over again, "We didn't kill any troops on the ground." Got very close, I guess, to Moscow and then stopped. The Belarus president negotiated some sort of ceasefire, and he is now, and a lot of the troops, Wagner troops, are now in Belarus. Putin wanted him tried for treason, and was apparently ranting. The Russian military was apparently unable to stop them for the longest time. Apparently, there was worries about bloodshed if they got any closer to Moscow. We're still not absolutely sure about what happened there. A lot of mixed analysis as to whether or not this indicates deep weakness on the part of the Russian regime. The analysis I've read have said Putin wanted this guy dead. The fact that he's not dead indicates deep weakness. Other people say Putin is not particularly weak, and this guy will probably eventually be dead or exiled. And the Ukrainians have been making advances, but not as on their counteroffensive, but not as many, not as far advances as they would have liked. But they have been making advances in their counteroffensives. The war doesn't seem to have been affected one way or another by these events. Although there has to be some type of morale issue, it appears that there were a lot of civilians that supported this group on their way, gave them food, showed up for them. Does this mean any type of cracks in the Russian leadership and their political control over Russia? Again, this is a topic of debate. But the question is what is the implications in the United States, and if this does lead ultimately to some type of cracks or let's say the removal of Putin from office, because apparently there are rumors that other leaders in Russia are interpreting this as a weakness by Putin, whether or not it in fact is. Should Putin be removed? Would that in fact lead to an end to the Ukraine war? Had Prigozhin had actually somehow prevailed in this, would that have even meant an end to the Ukraine war, or an escalation for that matter? We don't know. But if this is Russia starting to crack under the international pressure of the war, and let's say Putin is out in 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, would that guarantee a Biden win? I'm not sure, even if that's the case, this is sort of a multifaceted question. Winning wars doesn't necessarily even guarantee presidential wins. I mean, Bush in 1991 won the first Gulf War hands down, but it didn't really help him in the 1992 election. He still looked at his watch in the debate and had a recession and raised taxes after he said no new taxes. So that cost him the election, even though he had a good win in the war. But this is kind of a complicated question. But we could not. There were a lot of fears. Is this going to lead to chaos that leads to World War III? That seemed to be over exaggerated. I'm going to hand this over to you because there's so many elements to discuss here. Maybe this just fizzled away and we won't hear any more about this. Maybe this indicates the beginnings of something. Maybe we just don't know. Dave?
Thank you for that setup, as always. I would say, that there's so many details or narratives about the event itself that I personally find really interesting, and maybe we'll shed a little bit of light on that as we peel back the layers of the onion. But I think your premise here was that if hypothetically, if an event like this led to a weakening of Putin's position, and one of the things Putin said when this was all underway, kind of overnight, and Friday into Saturday, was Putin even said, "Hey, this is the beginning of a civil war. This is an insurrection. This is a coup." Like whatever language he was using, it was alarmist and alarming. And he said, the FSB or whoever that is going to declare Prigozhin a criminal, and we're going to, he and anybody who supports him are insurrectionists, and they're going to be taken care of. So but that was what he said. But when it came to what he did not really mobilize much effort against him. There was a limited mobilization, but not anything significant. And I think to me, that's a little bit kind of, that's a lane worth exploring about how this got resolved so quickly. And then what was the resolution? I think, like I said, I think those are interesting topics, but more to your original question, what would it mean to the US? And so if there's a silver lining here anywhere, it is that for a day or two, our media in our country in the West and, Europe and the United States came out and said, there is a thing slightly worse than Putin, and that's chaos, and that's nuclear weapons in the hands of a warlord, and that's an issue worth avoiding. And also some of the more optimistic commentators and some of the things that they spoke about were, well, if he was reasonable and tempered and measured in how he dealt with this crisis, that means he's not insane and he's not completely constitutionally unwilling to negotiate or to find a middle road path. I'm less inclined to give Putin, maybe he's really Machiavellian and really good at saving his own image and his own balance of power that he has with his regular military uniformed Department of Defense versus his private militia, irregular troops that he's got in Middle East, North Africa area, and Africa proper. These Wagner Group troops have been a component of his profile. So I think this is an internal struggle more than anything else. But again, if it was the case that there's a silver lining here, it's that in theory, maybe there's, rather than a decades-long Cold War Part 2, we might more quickly fast track a resolution. And if that was the case, again, to stipulate what you said, if that was the case that we revisited this and saw Putin or maybe one of his lieutenants who stepped up as somebody we can negotiate with, and then an end to this war, I think that would be an amazing turn of events for the American public, and Biden would benefit from that for sure.
Well, I mean, Leon Panetta is saying that this severely damaged Putin's hold. He's got a whole analysis on it. There are, other people who are saying it. On the other hand, other people, former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, says that it actually is potentially fatal to Putin. But other people are saying they don't. They think Putin can sail through this. That basically he's got enough control of the media and enough control of the way Russians think that he can that people will forget about this within in a month or two. That he's got enough fear over the others, and if he can manage to punish any allies of a Prigozhin, swiftly enough, even if he doesn't get to Prigozhin, it won't have mattered a whole lot. Others are saying the loss of those 7 aircraft actually can have a tactical tactical effect with Ukraine. That actually is not insignificant. But just by itself. But again, I'm sure they've got other aircraft that they can redeploy. But again, we don't know. The Biden administration has been very careful not to say a whole lot about it, other than to say that they're watching it very closely, as usually anybody would say. Trump said something about, well, careful what you're asked for, to say that Wagner taking over would be bad news or something like that. It wasn't quite sure what he meant, actually. That was my best guess at what he was saying. The rest of the Republican candidates pretty much kept their mouths shut, probably intelligently. Didn't hear anything from the Republican leadership in the Senate, really. They kind of dodged questions when they're asked. So a lot here, and then just watching the PBS analysts, nobody wanted to commit to anything really, as to what they wanted to say. I would say that if Putin goes down, though, that Biden would get credit for it. But I think that whether he wins or loses is really going to depend on the economy. Clinton's old, actually was his campaign manager, the Raging Cajun, back in 1992, had the thing that's the economy stupid. It's really going to be based on that. But if the Ukraine war ends, that could have a huge impact on the economy. If food is getting out there, the price of food would probably drop, and less pressure on resources, including oil and gas. So, you can't really separate those.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of U.S. domestic politics, I think you're right that more people are paying closer attention to the home front, to pricing and jobs and the overall that we probably are going to have a small recession soon, and if we can pull out of it before it really begins, I think Biden would get a lot of credit for that. But I do want to, while we're on this topic, I do think it's important, just because we brought this up as what the heck just happened in Russia. I do think it's worth mentioning a couple of the things about the incident itself. One thing is that, like you said, you're hearing this from Panetta, you're hearing that from this person. I looked at a lot of commentators, because this is something, that gets pushed to me, and I'm curious, and I'm reading a bunch of stuff. And so there's a full spectrum of including everything from optimism to pessimism, with some even saying this was no more than a stress test. It is the most significant domestic event during Putin's rule. And I think this challenge to normalcy could be considered the beginning of the end, ultimately, because that's what the U.S. wants, and the West. But alternatively, he's probably more likely to regroup, retrench his internal balance of power. So I want to explain why I think that. Putin, I think it's pretty clear. Prigozhin did not challenge Putin. His statements were against Moscow generals, Shoigu and Gerasimov, When he was in Rostov, in and around the Russian Southern Military Command, he was greeted by supporters there, and he did walk right in to the military command, regional command, and was greeted well. He didn't have to fire a shot to take over the Southern Command. So that's why some of these Russia analysts are saying, hey, if this guy could walk into Southern Command against the potential orders of the defense minister and the top general in charge, he's making a connection with people. But I do think his outsized role is not just because of Wagner's successes, air quotes, in Ukraine, or the perceptions of that on social media, but also he's built training camps, Prigozhin, in the region. So he had a serious footprint in Russia in that area. Yeah. But popularity is not the same thing as power. And I think Putin handled the situation delicately, measured use of force. I hate to give him a compliment, but in this case, it was for his own self-interest to keep Prigozhin's staff and supporters in his fold, because the main reason this happened was the private armies were issued an order to end their contracts and have all their soldiers sign on with the regular military. And that for Prigozhin, besides the cash cow aspect, for him it's a blow to his prestige. Yeah. Not to belabor this point, but
Putin is reportedly fuming that Prigozhin is free and not in prison or dead. I mean, he really wanted it, and that's where they're saying that he's weak, that he isn't getting his way.
I'm pretty sure that's U.S. propaganda. I hate to say it. I'm American. Yeah. I love America, but I think this is a friend of Putin's, that Putin benefits from him, and yeah, maybe if he really wanted him gone, he would do it. He's got 1 million troops. He's got 200,000 bodyguard, private Republican Guard of his own. He's got 12,000 tanks, 30,000 armored vehicles, 800 fighter jets, 500 attack copters. Wagner Group has 25,000 total men, limited resources spread across Africa, the Middle East, and Ukraine. There was no power. There's nothing preventing
no military power, but does he have the political will and the political power to do it? That's the question. But we'll see. We'll see what happens.
I don't think we can assume that just because race is taken into account, that necessarily creates an equal protection problem, because I understood that we looked at the history and traditions of the Constitution, at what the framers and the founders thought about. And when I drilled down to that level of analysis, it became clear to me that the framers themselves adopted the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment in a race-conscious way. That they were, in fact, trying to ensure that people who had been discriminated against, the freedmen, during the Reconstruction period, were actually brought equal to everyone else in society. When there was a concern that the Civil Rights Act wouldn't have a constitutional foundation, that's when the 14th Amendment came into play.
Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court wants to restore, I think, some of the integrity of the court. He has actually been coming up, he and a couple of the other justices have actually been ruling somewhat sanely of late, and particularly around voting rights and around particularly issues around the Voting Rights Act, and most recently had rejected what is referred to as the independent state legislature theory, something that has been pushed by the right wing and was actually a very important component of the so-called Eastwood Plan in the former President Trump's attempt to retain the presidency. The theory is that the legislature in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, the Elections Clause it's referred to, says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but Congress may at any time or law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. And then proponents also use the textual support for presidential electors. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress, but no senator, representative, or person holding office trust under the United States shall be appointed an elector. Of course, under the electoral college system, those are the people who actually officially choose the president. It's only been in the past 150 years or so that we hold primary elections as opposed to caucuses to determine how these electors are chosen. And the legislatures have been setting up these processes. So it has been a theory that we could hold these elections, but that the legislatures themselves could go ahead and decide to nullify those elections and appoint their own electors. And of course, that was a big topic this last time around when Trump put up his own electors, and when there were majorities and supermajorities of Republicans in certain states to say, hey, we don't want to honor our own election. We don't like the way it turned out. We are sending a new team of electors. Well, there have been several arguments against that, saying that, okay, yes, the Constitution does say that they can choose the method, but once they set it into law, once they pass laws, they have made their decision. They can't just arbitrarily change it later. And they, even in making those laws, they have to do it within the constitutional framework of their state laws, which they have established the constitutions in their various states. So in fact, when their constitutions grant their state courts jurisdiction to review their decisions with regard to the elections, they have in fact delegated the power to those states, and therefore that exercise of those courts is in fact the manner of choosing of those legislatures. So by allowing state courts to override them, it's not contradicting the Constitution at all. But the theory that the conservatives have been using is that no, they can be arbitrary. That's what the Constitution says, which makes absolutely no sense. And so this has come up, and the court basically rejected it last week in terms of, I believe it was in order to reject maps that were drawn up, I believe in Virginia. Do I have that right? North Carolina. And so this was not a Voting Rights Act issue. This was maps that were drawn up by Republican legislatures arbitrarily, again, for political reasons, apparently against state laws. But the legislature had also passed those state laws, and the courts overturned these maps on the basis of those laws. So the legislature sure chose how these elections were going to be done, but it also passed the laws based upon which they were overturned in the Supreme Court, and that's what the lower courts had decided. Supreme Court said, yeah, we're not going to mess with that decision. Of note, even Clarence Thomas said that wasn't rejecting it on maintaining the independent state legislature theory, but on the basis that you didn't have to take up the theory and deal with it. You could have just rejected the case on the basis that you don't have to take it. But it does seem like the independent state legislature theory is probably dead. Eastwood is said in a statement that he's hoping to keep it alive because this is a strategy that they want to be able to use in the future to overturn elections. They've been hoping that they could get into certain states, and they hope to do it in Arizona, and even when they lose elections, could possibly send their own slates of electors to Congress to be recognized and just completely ignore elections, because after all, we live in a republic and not a democracy. As they like to say, democracy is mob rule, and sometimes our legislatures have to step up and and stand up to mob rule and do what's right. And this is especially if elections have been mismanaged or something like that. So Supreme Court rejected that. That would seem to put an end to the issue, but people are saying not necessarily. Dave, I'm going to let you jump in here.
Yeah, so this is great because so much of the coverage is, media driven, and it's usually based on what they think people want to hear. Democracy was saved, and that sort of approach, which arguably this was massively significant for with that an impact similar in degree to those claims. But I like you presented it from a lawyerly perspective as a lawyer, and so I think that's a really I like looking at it through this prism, because one of the commentators, and I think only one, said this was like Marbury versus Madison, where you had the text of the Constitution, which says there's such a thing as checks and balances, but it was one of the first Supreme Court cases where the court said, oh, by the way, we could tell the legislature that what they did overstepped their power, and that's binding. The court basically gave itself that power. And people are saying that that's what this was Roberts' Marbury versus Madison moment, because what he was able to do is he didn't lay out a strictly defined system here, but what he said was literally, sorry for you folks who think the independent state legislature theory is supported by the Constitution, because in fact, the state courts do have review of state policy and action. It's not like when the country was first founded, the state legislatures appointed the senators. There was no election. So you could see how a strict constructionalist could say, hey, if they figured the state legislature was just going to pick the two senators from their state, why would the court be able to block that? And you could see that might have been the case in the 19th century. But fast forward to today, and Roberts just laid out the gauntlet that in fact, I'll give his exact quote. He said state courts do have a role in interpreting state constitutional issues. His quote was, the elections clause does not insulate state legislatures from the ordinary exercise of state judicial review. So yes, courts can review the legislature, period. And then he also said that federal courts have a role too. When those state courts are challenged, he left space for federal courts in the process. He said that federal courts, must not abandon their own duty to exercise judicial review. So state courts have power, federal courts have power. And then I think one of the key elements here, though, is why it's not like such a shining moment for democracy necessarily. He wanted to let everybody know that sometimes the Supreme Court might come down on the side of the state legislature when they so choose. He said, this is a quote, the questions presented in this area are complex and context specific. We only hold that state courts may not transgress the ordinary bounds of judicial review such that they arrogate to themselves the power vested in state legislatures to regulate federal elections. So in other words, you've got a lot of state courts out there drawing maps. And, it sounds like what he's saying is, look, we don't want state Supreme Courts drawing maps. That's not what we want. But at the same time, in this case, what we found is that the state Supreme Court of North Carolina actually withdrew their claim over this map because the election results flipped the party. It was a Democratic-leaning North Carolina state Supreme Court that overturned the North Carolina election map that the 2020 election was run off of. But now that they've flipped to Republicans, they said, oh, no, we don't really want, we don't want the court to hear this because the court might curtail the power here. So we don't even want you to hear it. But Roberts said, actually, we are going to hear it. And I think Neil Katyal gave some really articulate explanations of why it was important for the court to issue a finding. And so this was like a kumbaya moment where across the spectrum, a lot of thoughtful people say this was it was important that this was defined the way it was. And we could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, and this is where the concept, and this is really where I like to get into it, because there's so many people out there, particularly conservatives, whenever you talk to a Federalist Society person, and I did, and when I was in law school, have a lot of debates with them who don't distinguish between original intent and textualism. There's a big difference between the two, because textualism, you look at it and it says, yeah, it says that the state legislature will decide this, blah, blah, blah. But what it doesn't look in terms of original intent is that back in 1787, when people were talking about state legislatures, they weren't talking about a completely independent sovereign body. They were talking about a body that everybody understood was something that was going to be constitutionally regulated. So anything it did was going to be performed in the context of checks and balances within a constitutional framework. So, for them to do that, I mean, and Marbury versus Madison itself was passed in the context that the Constitution was created in the context of common law, English common law, where courts had asserted itself as having the power to override the other branches, because it didn't create law the same way legislatures did, and didn't have the power to enforce law the way it did. It was reactive. It wasn't productive. So it could actually have those powers. So it was implied in that. And when they said, well, when conservatives will say, maybe the Constitution overrode common law, it's like, well, read the Seventh Amendment. It refers to common law, so no, it didn't, right? If it's so this was so a legislature by definition is something that is constitutionally managed and regulated. So it's a really myopic view that is result oriented, fueled by a political agenda, and even Clarence Thomas didn't make the argument for it. So I don't think it has a whole lot of future there. And Clarence Thomas is the ultimate textualist, and even he didn't buy into it.
Right. No doubt. And again, I appreciate your law school experience in sort of supporting how I interpreted this. We're on the same page. I think the dissenters, one of the interesting elements of dissent, Kavanaugh, not dissent, but his own finding, but it wasn't part of Robert's concurrence. There you go. Thank you. Drawing a blank again. More lawyerly help. So Kavanaugh's concurrence. He says he would have gone further, and he would have defined that specific standard that would have limited the power of state court oversight. Of what is essentially a legislative function. So like this independent state legislature, if that was truly the case, that was real, just to be clear, since we're talking about it, that would have empowered state legislatures the ability to make decisions on all aspects of elections,
right,
from how people register, how they cast a vote, and nobody could ever challenge it in state court under the Constitution. So like you said, that doesn't even make sense. So what Kavanaugh was saying is, let's go back. What he said is he would have adopted the standard articulated by then Chief Justice William Rehnquist in Bush v. Gore in 2000, when the Supreme Court handed the election over to George Bush. Whatever, that's a whole nother story. But the idea is that, this is a quote, he would have allowed federal courts to strike down state court rulings that impermissibly distorted state law beyond what a fair reading required. So it would put in this fair reading standard, where the courts would be able to say, the Supreme Court or the federal courts could look and say, yeah, the state Supreme Court, you do have power, but you don't have as much power as you're exercising here. A fair reading, so it would have kept them in check a little bit. And the reason I mention this as being important is because that's where next is going to come from. What's the next lineage of cases that are going to define that standard that Roberts didn't want to go into at this time? And we have lots of opportunities. I'll let you take it away from here, but so Wisconsin, Ohio, New York, New Mexico, Utah, Kentucky, they are all in the mix for lawsuits here to get a little bit more granular on this fight between state legislatures and state Supreme Courts.
Yeah, and I just want to close out by emphasizing the irony of the theory, because what they're saying is that the old argument, is God so powerful that he could make a stone that's so heavy that he himself can't lift it? Well, what they're arguing is that the state legislature has absolute power, so that it cannot delegate power to the judiciary to regulate itself. So it's that it cannot pass, it cannot create a constitution to regulate its own power to regulate the elections. It can do what it wants with the elections, but it cannot set up a process by which regulates itself. It is the irony is just so bizarre in it, and you would bring that up with them, and they just stare at you, huh? I mean, it's just, but it comes up so much. I mean, Federalist Society students were just always, anyways, completely missed the point in so often. I think we've gone as far as we can on this.
To be continued.
This brings us to Biden's immigration policy. We've often talked about how Obama actually deported more people than in the given amount of time than Trump did. A lot of immigration activists referred to Obama as the deporter in chief. Not necessarily because his laws were more draconian, but probably because Obama was more efficient and he had more efficient people. But Title 42 came to an end, and the number of people crossing the border were dropped from 10,000 to a week to about 3,000, and there are a lot of criticism. Pardon me, a day. Sorry.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of criticisms from the right about it, but I think the right wing has to attack Biden just on immigration, just as an existential basis, because they can't not attack Biden on immigration issues, because if the right wing is not attacking Biden on immigration issues, their raison d'etre is just undermined. But the ACLU is also threatening to sue Biden on this, because they are arguing that the changes in the asylum policies aren't any better than Trump, maybe are even worse. And some of the things that are happening are, for instance, that you cannot come to the border and cross over and apply for asylum here without applying for asylum in the country that you pass through, i.e., Mexico, right? I'm not even sure if that means all the countries, right, or just the last one. They're not really changing, the stay in Mexico policy. Apparently, now they have ended the no tolerance policy. Not everybody who comes across is necessarily charged with a crime of crossing at a non-checkpoint. Apparently, they aren't separating the families, but it's really the immigrant advocate groups are really not happy with this. Now, it's there are also a lot of questions as to whether or not this is simply putting off the border crisis. Once people are applying for asylum in Mexico and they're rejected there, are they going to be back at the border again in 18 months or so? Is this just putting everything off until after the election? And really, what is the answer here? I mean, this is like the biggest, most profound difference in borders between sort of first and third world, or industrialized and developing world. And we've just got such destabilization due to a number of causes. Some would argue due to our policies over the years, economic and Cold War oriented and the like. Has Joe Biden finally just given up on a humanitarian border policy in favor of ending the quote unquote border crisis so that he can maybe win back over some moderates, on the border towns where the Democrats have actually been losing Latino votes over the chaos at the border. A lot to unpack here, but is the Democratic Party losing its soul on this?
In this instance, like you alluded to, there was whatever the metaphor is, like a nagging toothache. Hearing the critique over immigration, hearing the critique over the border, seeing the numbers, where 10,000 people a day is a lot of people.
Right.
So something had to be done. And then the question is it going to be the legal under U.S. law and international law commitments range of options that could be costly and could be unpopular, or is it the expediency of what it takes to satisfy, like you said, border voters and satisfying a constituency that isn't really the core of the Democratic Party, I would argue. So what are we talking about here? The circumvention of lawful pathways final rule. It says it, like you said, if you try to seek asylum, which is a legal right, you're denied automatically unless you applied through a country you passed through first. You can prove it. So that means that the country you went through has to have a functioning system and be able to give you documentation saying that you applied for asylum in those countries and that you were denied. And that's just not how it really works. Okay, so that's one element of this. Another is you have to make an appointment with Customs Border Protection through an app, a phone app known as CBP One. Now, number one, there's not enough appointments for most people. Number two, not everybody's literate in use of technology. Number three, the app, it doesn't function properly in many cases. For example, you have to upload a picture, but if you're black or brown, it sometimes doesn't recognize your face as a face, and so it doesn't even work. Sometimes the file sizes don't fit and the pictures don't go. But most often, people just get no appointment. So the only exception to that is unaccompanied minors, victims of trafficking, and people facing a medical emergency or an imminent threat of death. So really, they really only want to let a very small subset of people operate under the traditional asylum system, with nearly everybody else getting, the potential anyway, without an appointment for getting shipped back to their country of citizenship. That's why it dropped from, in the past, 83% of asylum seekers were allowed, but now it's down to 46% of people who apply for asylum are getting it, because they're saying, no, you're not eligible because you didn't apply somewhere else. So one of the things that you said, not to like filibuster here or anything, but one of the things that you said is that could they have done something different? And like I said, consistent with U.S. law and international law, there's a set of things that could happen. And I'll spell it out real quickly. The standard is, and this is a quote from a professor, Stacey Bruston, professor of law and director of Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Clinic at Catholic University of America. She said, this is the standard. Those who enter the U.S. and express a fear of persecution have the right to an interview with an asylum officer if they demonstrate credible fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, political opinion, or other protected ground. They should be permitted to apply for asylum. Those granted asylum are eligible for a green card and may petition to bring their family. That's the standard. But what they're seeing is like not consistent with that, which means it's illegal. So the current plan is clearly illegal. So what should they do instead? What they propose, the American Immigration Council has a whole bunch of humane alternatives, but real quick, they recommend expanding Border Patrol's capacity at the ports of entry, establishing regional process centers where federal agencies are co-located with NGOs who can carry out processing, coordinate release, provide effective case management for newly arrived immigrants because they need help navigating the process. in any practical system, that's kind of what we would want. If asylum is required, we would want to have in place a system that could process the backlog of 800,000 people who are waiting for an appointment. But that's
Right.
not what this administration has chosen to do.
I mean, they did, to be fair, they have expanded the resources that you can apply in Colombia or Venezuela. But the problem is, if you go apply for it in those countries, you can be seen. That's part of, if you're applying for asylum in that country, you don't want to be seen going into the embassy to apply for asylum. I mean, something is being missed in the translation there, and it's concerning to me as a progressive person that a policy is your policy as a semi-progressive, president is being slammed by the ACLU and Human Rights Watch and being supported by the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'm not a big fan on usually. I mean, it's not a right-wing organization, but it's not fairly progressive either. But it is. I'm also, my sentiments on immigration might play well on the left coast, even to some degree in Humboldt County, and certainly in the Greenbelt. It does not play well in Texas and along the border and in most of the country interior, in areas that Biden has to win. And 10,000 a day is a lot of people, and we're strapped resources. So what do we do, and what does he do? And he's in a rock and a hard place, and if he loses, it'll be right back to Title 42 and no zero tolerance. So what is the answer? I don't have one. I don't really have a brilliant answer to this. It is other than I really think the Democrats should be talking, and if it's a longer term solution, a Marshall Plan for Central and Northern South America. I mean, that should have, but we should have been talking about this decades ago, and not supporting regimes that have led to this, and climate change, and all of these issues that are bringing them here. What is the root cause? If we can't take in all these people, and I think we can take in more than we can. We have an aging population. We do know that we need younger people to work a lot of jobs. So we should be able to take them in, but we of course have the politics of the fact that there is a party that is openly bringing up replacement theory, and we've got this that fear that they that is at the center of their campaigns, and it is very a difficult politics. But I have to say, this is one of my biggest disappointments. It was one of my biggest disappointments with Obama, and it's one of my biggest disappointments with Biden. But I don't have a brilliant alternative for them.
So, one of my longtime friends, who's a conservative from New Jersey, asked me once, he said, what is it about Democrats that they care so much about people who are undocumented, and they're willing to support very unpopular policies in support of potentially growing the list of voters who are going to be Democratic because they appreciate getting here under a relaxed border policy or something to that effect? Why is it so important to deal with this issue? And I said, I think we should look at this a different way. Why is it so important to politicize an issue that ought not be political? People have been participating in the U.S. economy who don't live here and are not citizens, not permanent residents, forever. This used to be Mexico. Where we are used to be Mexico, right up to the Klamath River. This was Mexico. So the fact that that our agricultural system requires undocumented workers, and our office support system, and our meat packing industry, and there are many physical labor industries that require undocumented work. And our overall economy requires an increase in population that our own domestic folks, we're just not making enough babies. We need immigration. You've got countries like Germany that are recruiting people from all over the world to try to bring in more labor. It's actually, it should be a nonpartisan issue. But instead, and just to reiterate what the person from the Refugee Advocacy Clinic, she pointed out, the American Immigration Council, we've committed after World War II, we committed to the UN Charter. We committed to a respect and dignity, a humanitarian prism when we talk about migrants leaving persecution. That's the system we should be investing in. We should be investing in our needs as a country for all the things I just mentioned through a reasonable system. Now, to give Biden some credit, it was a hemorrhaging situation, highly political, third rail-ish kind of topic because of the climate that Republicans and Trump, I think, stoked because of how successful it is according to how voters respond. So it's just, so Biden kind of inherited a dilemma, and I think this is a band-aid. The band-aid is like, what are we going to do to try to, half a dose of dignity, half a dose of pragmatism, just try to discourage people from coming, and let's deal with asylum not at our border in a triage way. And this is what they came up with. And it's not consistent with the law, but it's a band-aid. So I mean, you said you're not a genius on this policy issue. I think the answers are there, but the climate for talking about them is not.
No, it's not. I mean, we can't even solve the DACA issue. Ever since Eric, what's the last name of the guy, the last Republican who was serious about immigration reform, who got primaried, Bannon, Eric, I'm forgetting the House member's name, Eric Cantor, thank you. It was, I mean, that was it. Nobody wants to do it anymore. None of the Republicans are serious about.
And Senator McCain was serious about it too.
Yeah, but it just it cannot happen because they do not want more. Well, we will be back on this topic. We'll see how this goes, and we'll see if there's any evolution of Biden's policy. But so far, I'm not impressed.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
Okay, this brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
So this one's interesting. 538 recently published an article called "Who's a Serious Candidate for the Republican Nomination and Who's Just Dreaming?" I thought that was a colorful title, but when I looked, like the first couple of sentences, it said, here's a quiz. How many Republicans are running for president? Technically, the answer is 267 candidates have formally applied to the Federal Election Commission to win the Republican nomination. 267. So that's obviously not a serious candidate list. And so what is a serious candidate? 538 says they're going to apply a rigorous criteria. It's a two-part test. Either pass the candidate, if they pass through it, they'll make the cut. One is the Republican threshold for participation in debates, meaning you're eligible, you filed, you're polling minimum of 1% in 3 methodologically sound national polls, or 2 in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina. You have 40,000 unique donors in at least 220 states. And you signed a pledge of fealty to the party. You're not going to participate in any unsanctioned debates. So the second one has 9 criteria. I'm not going to get into them in detail, but it is commitment to win, staff size, campaign travel, included in methodologically sound polls, media coverage, online survey, search activity, endorsements, prior public office experience. If you get 5 of those 9, then you make the cut and you're considered serious. Once they applied the seriousness test, they only got 11 that made the cut. But even in a climate of 11, knowing that might grow, there's a lot of candidates. So my prediction, even if this GOP circus doesn't get more crowded than it already is, there are enough people in the ring already to guarantee Donald Trump, with the support of half the party and a solid 30-point lead, will maintain his center ring status for the foreseeable future.
All right, I'm going up to Montana. The Republicans are coalescing around former Navy SEAL officer Tim Sheehy. He's a good-looking guy, a hero, and he's got all the right positions. He's very charismatic. To run against John Tester, who is a three-time winner Democrat, and John Tester but the problem is Sheehy hasn't been there very long. John Tester is a farmer, deep roots in Montana. I think they're making a mistake. I think they need to find another farmer. I'm predicting that John Tester is going to win a fourth time there. I think the Republicans have an opportunity to take the Senate. They probably are going to do very well in West Virginia, but I think they messed up here and are not going to defeat John Tester. We'll see if I'm right. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.